So when people talk about the New Testament, they imagine chaos, like nobody knew what belonged. But the early church overwhelmingly recognized the same core books we have today. A few took longer to reach universal acceptance, like Second Peter, Jude, and Revelation, but they were still known and they were still used. Origin mentions they were disputed, yet he still quotes them as if they were scripture. Eusebius lists the universally accepted books, the Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, First Peter, First John, and then notes a few still being discussed. And by Athanasius in 367 AD, you get the full list of 27 books. And he says, in these alone is the teaching of godliness proclaimed. The early church didn't invent the canon. They recognized the books already functioning as scripture. Keep rocking with me, y'all. I love this topic. Now, when the apostles wrote their letters and the gospels, they weren't copied by professional scribes. They were copied by everyday believers in house churches scattered across the empire. That means you'll find spelling mistakes, you'll find swapped word order, and what scholars call textual variants. But instead of weakening the text, these variants actually strengthen our confidence. Because the copying was so widespread, we can compare thousands of manuscripts and see exactly where the differences are. F. Bruce said the variants come from human error and not deliberate corruption. And because we have so many manuscripts, we can reconstruct the original with extraordinary accuracy. God preserved his word not by eliminating human mistakes, but by overwhelming manuscript evidence. Welcome to the transmission of the New Testament, y'all. Let's get it. Here's something most people don't know. Conservative scholarship, and even some surprising liberal scholars, argue that almost all the New Testament was written before AD 70. But why? Because not a single book mentions the destruction of the temple, even when it would have strengthened the author's point to do so. Acts ends abruptly with Paul alive in Rome, which strongly suggests it was written before his death in the mid 60s. Luke depends on Mark, so Mark must be earlier still, and Paul's letters are universally dated before AD 67. J.A.T. Robinson, who wasn't a conservative, he concludes all the New Testament books were written before 70. That places the writings incredibly close to the events they describe. So anyone claiming that these writings, these books were written way later, 2nd, 3rd century, they're either woefully ignorant or they're deliberately being deceptive. Don't buy into that. So, before the New Testament existed as a collection, the early church used the Greek Old Testament. I mentioned this before, the Septuagint. And yes, the books we now call the Apocrypha were included in that collection, but the Jews never considered those books equal to Scripture. Roger Beckwith's research shows that while the Apocrypha was valued and read, it wasn't stored in the same sacred location in the temple as the canonical books. They were respected, but not treated as inspired. So, the early church inherited the Septuagint, but they didn't inherit the Jewish understanding of which books were actually canonical. That's why later Christians became confused about the Apocrypha. They didn't know the history behind it. And that's all that is. That's why it was in the King James Version, first edition, then it was removed. So after the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jewish people, Christians gradually became disconnected from Judaism. Over time, many believers simply assumed that everything in the Septuagint was scripture. But several major Christian thinkers knew better. Origen distinguished between books the church read and the books that were truly canonical. Jerome said the Apocrypha was for edification, not doctrine. Luther placed them in a separate section. Athanasius excluded them from his canon list. Melito of Sardis even traveled to Palestine to learn the Jewish canon firsthand. So the idea that the Apocrypha was removed is backwards. It was added later by Christians who just didn't know the Jewish history behind it. So look, I mean, if you've If you're a Christian who's ever asked, what's up with all these books? Well, here's your answer. This is what's up with all them books. A lot of people online love to say books were removed from the Bible or the church hid the real scriptures, but these claims fall apart the moment you look at actual history. Nobody removed books. The early church recognized the writings that had already been functioning as scripture for decades. The people making these claims don't know anything about textual criticism, manuscript families, patristic citations, or how the canon actually formed. They're repeating something they heard in a dramatic TikTok video, not something that's grounded in real scholarship. The real story is far more interesting and far more trustworthy, if you ask me. The Bible wasn't curated by conspiracy, it was preserved through widespread copying, early recognition, and consistent use across the ancient world. So, in the first and second centuries, Christians weren't debating whether the Gospels or Paul's letters were authentic. They were already quoting them as scripture, reading them in worship, and copying them throughout the empire. Irenaeus in the second century says, it is not possible that the Gospels can either be more or fewer in number than they are. That's barely a century after Jesus. And today we have something the early church just didn't have, a critical Greek New Testament. I used the Nestle Aland 28th edition, and the textual apparatus at the bottom shows every known variant. When you see how small and insignificant most of them are, you realize just how well the text has been preserved. We have an extremely high probability of knowing exactly what the apostles wrote. Till next time, y'all. Deuces.